Dorothy stood in her Ohio kitchen in 1956, staring at a shelf of canned tomatoes, doing math in her head. The story going around says a can cost 9 cents that year, but Labor Department records put the real price closer to 15 cents for a standard no. 303 can. That correction matters, because the real story here isn't about a cheap can, it's about what an entire generation did with expensive ones. By the end of this, you'll know 5 specific meals, 1 shocking cake recipe, and why this whole system quietly disappeared. Canning wasn't invented during the Depression. It had already been commercial since the 19th century, but hardship turned it into a survival skill. During World War II, American households canned more than 4 billion cans and jars of food in 1943 alone, and nearly 3.5 billion quarts in 1944. Rationing and victory gardens pushed people to preserve everything they grew, and that habit didn't vanish the moment the war ended. A 1933 cookbook actually laid out full emergency meals, built almost entirely from cans: vegetable beef soup, a scalloped corn, canned pears, and biscuits, all in one sitting. So the idea that canned food could be the whole meal, not just a side, existed 20 years before Dorothy's kitchen. Take salmon cakes, first on our list: canned salmon mixed with breadcrumbs, egg, and onion, then fried into patties that stretched one small tin into 4 servings. Families who couldn't afford fresh fish leaned on this hard, and one Depression-era account describes a single can of salmon feeding a large family in 3 different forms across a week. Bake that same mixture in a loaf pan instead of frying patties, and you get salmon loaf meal 2, dressed up enough to look expensive on a plate. Here's the part nobody expects. The canned food companies weren't passive in this. The American Can Company printed entire cookbooks pushing recipes like corn and tomato chowder and bean pie. Meal 3 is exactly that: chowder, corn and tomatoes simmered with broth or milk, a formula pulled straight from their own promotional recipe booklet. Meal 4 is baked beans with pork, tracked specifically in retail price data as a standalone grocery category through the 50s. Onions, mustard, and a spoon of brown sugar turned a flat can of beans into something that tasted deliberate instead of desperate. Now here's where it gets interesting. Meal 5 is the one that actually became famous: green bean casserole, invented in 1955 by Dorcas Riley inside Campbell's own test kitchen. Canned green beans, condensed mushroom soup, fried onions, that's the entire recipe, and it's still on tables every November 70 years later. Dorothy would have seen an ad for this exact dish in a magazine the same year it launched. What changed between the Depression version of thrift and the 1950s version wasn't the ingredients, it was the marketing. In the 30s, saving a can meant surviving the week. By the 50s, the same can meant saving the housewife 20 minutes, and Campbell's, Del Monte, and the American Can Company all understood that shift perfectly. Condensed tomato soup got folded into cake batter, not as a joke, but as a real marketed recipe called tomato soup cake. It sounds absurd until you realize the sugar and acidity in the soup work almost like a spice blend, and the cake genuinely turned out moist. That's the kind of detail that tells you these weren't just poor people eating badly, they were resourceful people building an entire food language out of tin cans. Dorothy's own pantry wasn't only cans. Dried beans, potatoes, flour, cornmeal, and eggs sat right alongside them because the real skill was combination, not just opening a lid. And the system had a shelf life nobody warned her about. Refrigerators spread into more homes through the 50s, supermarkets doubled in number between 1948 and 1958, reaching over 2,500 nationally. Fresh produce started showing up in more stores, more months of the year, and the whole reason canned food had dominated her kitchen started disappearing. Home canning itself fell from 44% of households in 1954 down to 34% just a decade later in 1964. So this wasn't canned food going out of style, it was canned food losing its only real competitive advantage: availability. One more correction before we move on. The claim that none of these recipes were written down is flat wrong. Women's magazines, home economics departments, and recipe booklets documented thousands of them. The real problem was that this knowledge got scattered across so many small pamphlets and community cookbooks that no single archive ever held all of it together. Dorothy didn't need an archive. She had a drawer full of clipped recipes and a mother who'd taught her which cans stretched furthest. And that's the piece most people miss when they romanticize this era. It wasn't nostalgia, and it wasn't poverty either. Canned food had become actual household infrastructure, as basic as running water. Some families used it because it was cheap, some because they had no refrigeration, some because fresh produce simply wasn't sold nearby yet. Every one of those reasons pointed to the same 5 cans on Dorothy's shelf: tomatoes, corn, beans, salmon, and condensed soup. Picture her kitchen table on a Tuesday night in 1956, 1 can of tomatoes turning into gravy poured straight over warm biscuits. No meat required, no waste, just flour, fat, and a can that cost 15 cents doing the work of a much more expensive dinner. That single dish tells you everything about the mentality. Stretch what you have until it becomes something you'd actually want to eat. By the end of the decade, that mentality had a new competitor, and its name was convenience marketed as modern. The Smithsonian's own research into the period calls canned food the original convenience food, years before frozen dinners existed. 2 cans of soup combined into 1 skillet. That was considered a full recipe in some 1950s cookbooks, no cooking skill required at all. Dorothy's daughter would grow up in a kitchen with a freezer, and she'd never learn half the tricks her mother used with a can opener and a spoon. That's the real ending of this story, not that canned food was bad, but that an entire cooking philosophy quietly aged out of American kitchens. Depression thrift, wartime preservation, and post-war convenience all lived inside the same 5 ingredients for about 20 years. Then refrigeration, supermarkets, and rising incomes gave people options Dorothy's generation never had, and the old system simply stopped being necessary. Here's my honest take. We lost something practical when that happened. Not just a set of recipes, but a habit of never wasting a single ingredient in the house. Every one of Dorothy's 5 dishes, salmon cakes, salmon loaf, corn chowder, pork and beans, and that green bean casserole, still work in a kitchen today. Try any one of them with today's grocery prices, and you'll understand instantly why an entire generation built their week around a shelf of cans. The tomato soup cake alone is worth making just to see if your own kitchen can handle a Depression-era plot twist. Dorothy never knew her 15-cent can of tomatoes would end up explained in a video 70 years later. But she'd probably recognize every single dish on this list without needing a single label to tell her what it was. If you want to see exactly how a wartime shortage created one of America's strangest food habits, the video right after this one covers it in full. Watch that next, because the pattern behind Dorothy's pantry didn't start in the 50s, it started decades earlier, and it's stranger than you think.